He choked on his own secretions before the notaries even sat down to draft his last will and testament. Dark mucus oozed from his mouth, his eyes glazed over with fear, and his skin, swollen and blotchy, cracked from internal pus. Servants covered their noses as they passed food through the curtains, and no priest dared to remain alone with him. This was a king who had been feared in life and shunned in death. The last weeks of Frederick II, King of Burgundy, were not recorded in the official chronicles. However, reports from his valets, letters from his doctors, and dirty, charred interrogation sheets, rewritten years later, have survived. From these, it appears that the decline began suddenly. After morning mass, he was carried out, staggering, with red spots on his cuffs. The skin on his elbows and shoulders began to darken, become wet, and stick to the silk. He was taken away without any explanation to those around him. 2 days later, tubs of vinegar, goat fat soap, and 3 sacks of salt were brought into the bedroom. The physician Anselm wrote, "Our master emits a foul odor uncharacteristic of a living body. The areas of decay are spreading. Pus oozes from under his fingernails. There is a black living ulcer on his tongue." The servants were changed every day. Those who stayed overnight refused to speak. One hanged himself after a week. Another disappeared. Security was tightened. Even the crown prince was forbidden from entering the chambers. Only 2 men stood by the bed, a silent bodyguard and the king's brother, Count Mathieu, who never missed an opportunity to whisper with the apothecary. According to reports, a struggle began behind the doors. The advisors were divided into 2 factions, supporters of the count and supporters of the queen, who, after 2 miscarriages, was considered barren and therefore had no support among the aristocracy. Rumors spread that the poisoning came from the chambers themselves, but poison did not explain the smell of death, nor did it explain the white worms found under the monarch's feet when he fell from his bed once again. On the 5th day, an abscess burst on his side. Pus flowed down his back under the sheets, which were stained with round brown rings. The skin on his chest became porous, like rotting fruit. The apothecary insisted on bloodletting, but the veins would not yield. When they tried to pierce the skin, bubbling yellow pus oozed out, smelling of rotten milk and coppery blood. According to the records, it was not until the 8th day that a church commission was summoned. The bishop refused to enter the bedroom, citing demonic manifestations. In his letter to the archdeacon, he wrote, "I saw through a crack how his hands were scratching his chest, leaving flesh under his fingernails. This is not a disease, this is punishment." That same evening, 3 servants set fire to their clothes and threw themselves into a well. Friedrich screamed at night. The moans were so unnatural that all the pages were removed from the south wing. It was said that he was calling for his dead mother, seeing his father without a head, hearing the cathedral he had never built burning. Rumors spread that marks had appeared on his stomach, circles like tree rings, each swarming with maggots. This was confirmed by one of the mute servants. His notes, written on a board, were preserved in a monastery copy. Meanwhile, the entrances to the castle were blocked. The collar of his shirt was cut out because the skin on his neck had turned into a rotting crust. A dark, sticky film covered his ears. His face was swollen, his lips were cracked, and his teeth were loose and fell out when he coughed. He refused to eat. He drank only opium. The doses increased, but he did not fall asleep. His pupils narrowed, but his voice grew louder. The smell penetrated the stone. The courtiers began to leave the palace under various pretexts. In the kitchen, people worked in masks, and the windows were covered with cloth soaked in vinegar. Flies began to gather in the upper chambers. One of the scribes notes, "We prayed for it all to end, but he continued to live. He continued to breathe through the pus. He continued to decay while still alive." Leaving him in this state meant committing a sin against the throne, but removing him would mean revealing a palace coup. When he began to vomit, pieces of mucous membrane came out with the bile. They collected it in a basin to show the healers, but they refused to return. One of them went to a monastery saying, "I saw hell looking into a man." 2 weeks later, the skin on his back completely separated from his body. He was laid on fresh cloth every evening. The sheets were burned. This entered the court chronicles as the days of black ash. At that time, orders were given to prepare a will, but Frederick's hand would not hold the pen. He asked the notary to dictate aloud, but the latter could not bear the screams and ran out, covered in vomit. The next day, Duke Mathieu gave orders not to let anyone in, not even the queen. Only the apothecary and 2 bodyguards remained with him. The physician Anselm fled. He was later found dead in the forest, with his tongue cut out. By that time, his body was emitting such a pungent odor that the doors to the east wing, where the king's chambers were located, were tightly closed, and the guards were changed every 2.5 minutes. According to one of the guards, as recorded in a later report by the chief of the royal guard, there was no air, only a stench that penetrated the ears, the fabric, and the skin. The king was not washed. He was not changed. Servants carried out sheets wrapped like funeral shrouds and threw them into a specially dug pit outside the garden. The senior bath attendant, Anselm, who was questioned later, claimed that from April 17th there was always pus on the sovereign's bed, sometimes thick, sometimes like water, sometimes with bubbles, and sometimes even with maggots. The monarch was delirious. His face was covered with ulcers, and the skin on his forehead was cracking like old parchment. An ointment made from crushed rose petals, and oil had no effect, probably because of the onset of internal tissue decay. His right eye was stuck shut with pus, and his left eye barely blinked. He whispered in the priest's ear, although there was no one else around. The doctors had been called away by order of the royal secretary to prevent rumors from spreading. But it didn't help. 2 cooks disappeared from the palace kitchen. One of them, as it later transpired, made his way to the coachman and told him about a human carcass that called everyone by name, but could no longer even raise itself on its elbows. Through him, the news reached the episcopate, and silent pressure began. If the king died in filth, it meant that his soul had been rejected by God. Meanwhile, the Duke of Orleans, the monarch's nephew, began collecting signatures for a secret will. His men had already come to the dying man's chambers 3 times, but they were unable to get his signature. His fingers were like wood, swollen, blackened, with burst blood vessels under his nails. One of the witnesses claimed that the pen slid across his skin like boiled liver, unable to find a foothold. Rumors spread. Some said that the king was cursed. Others said he had been poisoned. The most desperate servants from the eastern side began to bring their personal belongings to the door: rings, coins, pieces of cloth, in the hope of a cleansing ritual. One ambassador, seeing how the soldiers were treating the walls with vinegar, wrote in a letter, "They are not treating him. They are already afraid that the house will turn into a tomb." By the morning of April 28th, no one had slept in the king's room. The candles burned out on their own. Cigarette butts from sacred herbs, crushed potions, and stains of black liquid lay on the floor. No one even bothered to change the nighttime duck. It was simply carried out along with the bedding. Father Mathieu, the court confessor, described it this way: "I entered at a signal from the guards. The door was ajar, but steam was coming from inside. The monarch was lying on his back. His mouth was half open and pus was flowing from it. On his chest was a living ulcer and something was moving inside it. I said a prayer, but he did not respond. Only one eye was watching. Only one eye." A day later, the royal council decided to restrict access to the east wing. An explanation was devised: a threat of a bloody cold, although even the doctors had no doubt that this was not a disease but decay. Darkness emanated from the body. Later, it was written that he had developed self-developing rot. The body continued to live, but no longer as itself. A murky liquid with black streaks flowed from the open seam on his stomach. Pierre, a servant who wrote a note found in his boot after his suicide, claimed, "I saw his intestines pulsating. I saw his skin blistering. I heard him calling the dead." The archbishop refused to give the king communion. His confession never took place. According to the documents, none of the clergy wanted to be the last to hear the pleas of Decay. His soul was declared lost before he died. This was unprecedented. But the body lived on, and that was the most terrifying thing. He did not die. He continued to exist as a heavy mass of rotting flesh that moaned at night and trembled in the candlelight. The servants no longer entered the room without crossing themselves. Once, the night watchman Jean threw a rat's skull under the door as an amulet, as a curse, as an admission of powerlessness. On the third day, after they stopped turning him over, the skin on his back stuck to the mattress. An attempt to peel it off caused severe bleeding that could not be stopped. The servant holding the basin dropped it, and blood and pus splashed onto the floor. A half-digested lump floated in it, probably part of his stomach. The chief medic's report, written on a scrap of parchment, noted, "The back is dark, decomposed, the body is exuding steam, the skin is peeling off in layers. The room reeked of rancid lard, vinegar, rotten liver, and rotten eggs. Mold had grown on the windows. Worms had infested the table, not only in the king's body, but also in the wood. Some claimed to have seen them in the inkwell. The feathers were soggy, and the paper would not hold ink. Everything nearby began to smolder. The king did not speak, but he made sounds that were compared to moaning, a dog's growl, or a muffled cry. One of the witnesses, a young servant named Bastien, said, "It was as if he was chewing something. His lips moved, but they did not form words. It was as if he was eating his own soul." The guards stood at a distance. They were allowed to take turns every 2 minutes. Even the most skilled doctors refused to treat him. The last person to try to approach him, an old doctor named Bernard, fainted when he saw 2 worms crawl out of his mouth. No one saw him again. Panic broke out in the palace. The heirs began to demand that the will be signed by force. But no one could force the monarch to take the pen. His hands had turned black and thick as logs. His fingers would not bend. Once, his hand fell from the bed and hung motionless, like a piece of dried meat. The doctors were afraid to lift it. The tissue was too fragile and could tear. By order of the council, a group of priests was summoned to perform an exorcism. They read prayers for 3 days in a row, taking turns, but nothing worked. On the contrary, by nightfall, slime appeared on the floor. Someone saw a rat that ate a piece of bandage and died nearby. The court laundress refused to take his laundry, even with gloves on. The palace lawyer wrote, "His Majesty's body is beyond description. It is alive, but beyond human comprehension. We do not know whether this is punishment, illness, or divine retribution." An attempt was made to conduct a confession through the bars, but even then, the priest refused. He said that the spirit has already departed. However, that same night, the king began to call out loudly to the dead. He pronounced the names of deceased servants, old treasurers, saints, and heretics. His voice was hoarse, full of mucus, and breaking into incoherent muttering. The sound was recorded in the black book of the court. It was the first time in history that a monarch's voice was recorded as uninterpretable. As his body continued to decay, reality in the palace collapsed. The kitchen worked every other day. Servants left without taking their wages. The choirs no longer sang in the mornings. The candles disappeared from the main chapel. Everything in the east wing was gradually dying. The king's body no longer retained moisture. With each breath, fluid oozed out, leaving round wet spots with a purulent rim on the sheets. Doctors described it as death oozing through the pores. A black blister the size of a fist protruded from his stomach, which burst on the 23rd day of his illness, spilling out something thick with a cadaverous odor. A guardsman standing at the door tore his fingernails out in fear and was declared insane. On the 27th day, his intestines began to come out through an ulcer in his groin. This was confirmed by the testimony of 3 servants. Something slid down his thigh like an intestine. The next day, the monarch did not open his eyes. His breathing was barely audible, but his whole body continued to move, as if something inside was still fighting. By the evening of the 31st day, he began to make a loud wheezing sound. It was not like a death rattle, but a repeated cry, as if his entrails were stuck in his throat and trying to get out. According to witnesses, the sound continued for almost 2 hours. The servants lined up along the corridor and waited to see who would dare to enter first. When the Arch-Chancellor finally entered, he saw blood bubbling from the king's mouth. There were bite marks on his lips. Maggots were crawling out of his stomach near his navel. "He's not dead yet," said the Chancellor, "but he's already gone." On the 32nd day, at dawn, his breathing became irregular with long pauses. According to the guards sitting at the door, half an hour before dawn, he heard a sound as if liquid was being squeezed out of his belly. Then there was silence. No moans, no sighs, just nothingness. The undertaker, who had been called in advance, refused to lift the body. According to him, it was still moving and steam was coming out of it. All that remained of the monarch lay on straw soaked with pus. The sheets were yellow-green in color with deep stains. The abdomen had split open along the seam of an ulcer, and indescribable clots fell out. The ribs were visible. The skin between them burst. A brown liquid flowed from the nose and ears. The eyes were sunken. The lips were covered with a crust. But the most terrible thing was that quiet clicks could be heard in the room. Larvae, they were moving inside and outside. He died alone, but not in silence, wrote one of the last witnesses. After his death, the body was left in the room for another day. No one dared to touch it. Then a decision was made to destroy the bed, not to wash or boil it, but to burn it. In a closed courtyard, behind a blank wall, without any announcements or priests present, all the bedroom furnishings were piled up and set on fire. The sanitary cleaning report states, "Due to excessive decomposition and the danger of infection, it has been ordered to destroy all fabric, wood, and utensils. Even the bronze parts were covered with mold. Let us refrain from ceremonies." The remains were wrapped in leather and clay to stop the flow of fluid. The burial was postponed. There was no final will. The heirs started a war just 3 days later, without ceremony, without mourning, without a funeral service. One of them declared himself the new ruler, even before the death was officially recognized. The archbishop refused to conduct the service. He cited an insurmountable stench, the indescribable condition of the body, and fear of the wrath of God. In his words, what lay on that bed was more a curse than a body. Cracks appeared on the walls of the chapel, and candles burned out without wind. It was decided, no public funeral, only a closed ritual, only in the dungeon. While the body remained in the castle, rats came out of the cellars. Several of them were found dead near the doors. One was found in the bedroom. It was said that it died from eating a piece of flesh that had fallen from the bed. By order of the council, all the rooms were fumigated. The walls were scraped with knives. The ceiling was whitewashed. Everything that could be torn off was removed. The floor was washed with vinegar. Documents confirm. The smell remained despite 6 fumigations, 2 changes of carpets, and the replacement of the shutters. Some courtiers left altogether, declaring that the castle was cursed. Politically, the monarch's death was a disaster. The will was not found. The treasury was sealed. The council split into 2 factions. One of the pretenders to the throne began executions on the 4th day after the old sovereign's death. Rumors of a curse spread throughout the capital. Children were born dead. Priests had visions. Bread turned black in the barns. Some wrote that the king did not die. but disintegrated. In one of the later medical treatises published in a neighboring kingdom, the case is described as complete purulent disintegration of personality on the basis of tyranny, gluttony, and spiritual decay. It is noted, such a level of organic degradation has not been observed in any known ruler. In the Chronicle of 34 Days, compiled under the dictation of an old chronicler, we read, "The body was stronger than the crown, but weaker than dust. He held power, but could not hold his breath. His last days were torture for all who still breathed nearby. No one mourned him, for there was no one to mourn. Everyone had fled." On the 8th day after his death, the body was taken away at night in a closed coffin wrapped in straw and blue cloth. The coffin was nailed shut with iron nails. He was buried outside the chapel, in the far corner of the crypt, without a name. Only a metal disc with a date was placed on the coffin, and no prayers were said. No priest said a word. No candles were lit. Thus ended the monarch, whose name was no longer spoken aloud. The official chronicle referred to him only as the late sovereign. The people referred to him as the one who rotted alive.